This is CNN Breaking News.
Hello, I'm Lynda Kinkade. We are following breaking news out of London. A man has been shot dead by police following what's been described as a terror-related incident. Now, this happened in South London's Streatham area. Emergency responders are currently on the scene. They have been treating the injured. We've got our correspondent standing by for you. Hadas Gold is live in London on the scene, and our international diplomatic editor, Nic Robertson, joins us from our London bureau. I want to start with you first. Hadas, just bring us up to speed with what you're hearing.
Yeah, Lynda, so just before 2 p.m. is when London Emergency Services said they first received calls of an incident happening here in Streatham. This is the Streatham High Street. We're about 8 miles south of central London. This is a very busy high street full of shops and restaurants. Now, the police say that it does appear that one man went on some sort of stabbing spree and stabbed at least 2 people. All we know so far is that at least 2 people are injured. We do not know the conditions of those people. The suspect, however, police have confirmed, has been shot dead. This all happened just around 2 p.m. Now, this entire road has been shut off to also residents who can no longer go back to their apartments or leave the area. It is still very much secure. There's lots of emergency vehicles around here. You can also see just down the street. If you see down the street, right as the street sort of bends, that is where the incident happened, around a pharmacy and a cash converter area. Still lots of police presence out here. There's also helicopters still flying above us. Now, I actually just spoke to a man who lives in this area, whose brother-in-law lived right above where the incident took place, and he showed me some photos and videos that jive with what we are also hearing from other witnesses. It appears as though the man was holding some sort of machete and also had some sort of silver canisters either attached to him or near him. Now, this is strikingly similar to what we saw in the December London Bridge terrorist attack, where a man was stabbing people and also had some sort of devices attached to him. Of course, in these situations, police do not know if these devices are real or fake, what they may be, and so police respond accordingly. Now, we have confirmed that police have shot this man dead. They say they do not believe there are other suspects, and they have contained the situation. Of course, now there are still many, many questions. Investigations are underway to figure out exactly who the suspect is. We do not have a name yet. We don't know where he is from, if he is from this area, if there are any other connections, family connections. Police will be looking into all of his background information, where this person is from, where they may have traveled to, who they are connected with. We still don't know also the conditions of the victims. We do have statements from the London mayor and from Prime Minister Boris Johnson extending condolences and saying they're doing everything they can to investigate this incident. Unfortunately, of course, knife crime and these types of incidents we've now seen them just 2 times now in just the last couple of months. Still lots of questions to be answered here, but this is not an area that is necessarily used to this type of activity. This is a sort of quiet residential area 8 miles south of central London. It is a busy high street, but it's very residential, lots of shops, lots of families, people out with dogs. This is definitely shaking up this community, Lynda.
Yeah, no doubt. Hadas Gold, good to have you there on the scene. I want to just keep you there for now and bring in our Nic Robertson. Nic, as Hadas was saying, it sounds like police believe that the suspect was acting alone and that there wasn't a bigger network at play. What I found interesting was that police were so quick to call this a terror-related incident.
Well, there seem to be those similarities, as Hadas was saying, with that London Bridge attack on the 29th of November last year, late 2019. The attacker then appeared to have some sort of device strapped around him with wires coming out from it. And as soon as the armed police were on the scene and able to disengage the civilians who were trying to restrain him from the knife-wielding attacker, then the police shot that person dead. And it does appear to be a similar scenario here. And thinking back to the London Bridge attack in the summer, June the 3rd of 2017, the 3 men who drove a van knocking people down, they killed 8 people before they took off on foot and were stabbing people again. And again, the police identified them as a terror threat in a large part because they had, again, what appeared to be suicide vests or explosives or something very clearly strapped to the outside of their bodies. Now, in the 2 cases I've just mentioned, neither of those devices that were strapped onto people proved to be viable devices. But the police in these scenarios in London these days cannot stand back and take in a busy residential neighbourhood, cannot take the risk. And we've heard both the Prime Minister, the Mayor of London and the Home Secretary today all giving their sympathy and support for the victims, but also giving their support for the speed and actions of the police force. Both the Home Secretary Priti Patel and the Mayor of London being very clear on that particular issue, and it does underline, if you will, the responsibility that's put on the police officers and their commanding officers, who will be in touch with them, who will get the details from the officers on the ground before an authorization is given to take that shot. But it is very much the understanding of those officers put in the front line like that, and that is something that you know, in recent years in London there had been concern amongst armed officers that they didn't have the level of support from the community or senior officers. But now it is very clear from this incident, from the recent incidents, that this is the method, the operating procedures that the police are using, because they deem this terror threat to be very real. Even though the terror threat in the UK has been taken down a notch in the past few months, they deem this as very real and the best way to neutralize a potential threat. When somebody puts on and straps to their body what are supposed to look like apparently potential explosive devices, it is very clear in this country what they can expect the police to do if they're encountering them in an armed environment, such as an environment where they've been stabbing people. It is very clear what the police orders and expectation upon them is.
It certainly is. They certainly didn't want to take any chances here. Nick, just stand by for us. We do have a tweet in from the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who said, thank you to all the emergency services responding to the incident in Streatham, which the police have now declared as terrorism related. My thoughts are with the injured and all those affected. Hadas, I want to go back to you on the injured. We know 2 people have been stabbed. Any indication as to when we'll hear back from police as to an update on their condition?
We do not have any update on their conditions quite yet. All we know is that 2 people have been stabbed. There have been some eyewitness reports about those people and how bystanders came immediately to their aid. Actually, just a few seconds ago, we saw what looked like big white police vans or trucks. They didn't have any windows, any markings on them. They potentially might be forensic, sort of crime scene trucks. There was a line of them, about 3 of them, that started making their way through a side street down towards the scene. Of course, it's still a very active crime scene. There's plenty of police around here. They've pushed all this back. They've completely cleared the scene. We've spoken to also residents here who have said that they're not allowed to go back to their houses or for their families who are within their apartments to leave the apartments either. This is still very much an active scene, completely on lockdown, and they've completely blocked off, I'd say, at least 3 to 4 blocks of this very busy high street, normally on a Sunday evening, Sunday afternoon, full of people shopping, going to restaurants, going to cafes. This is a very much developing incident. We are still awaiting word, as you noted, both on the victims, what their conditions are, who they are, and of course on the suspect, who the suspect is, what their connections may be, and why and where exactly all this happened, because we actually don't know. Did this start within a shop or within a restaurant and then come out onto the street? Did it start on the street the entire time and then end there? Still a lot of questions to be answered in the situation. Of course, we'll keep you updated as soon as we hear more.
All right, Hadas Gold for us in London, not too far from the scene of this terror-related attack. Nic Robertson in our bureau, good to have you both with us. If you can stand by, and we'll come back to you shortly. But for now, I want to bring in the Managing Director of the security company International Corporate Protection, Will Geddes, who joins us on the phone from London. Will, good to have you with us. I just want to get your response first to this terror-related incident. Now that we know that a man has been shot dead in the south of London after stabbing 2 people, he was seen wearing some sort of device around his torso.
Yes, no, I mean, I think pretty much as your correspondents were saying, we're seeing an emerging pattern of these kind of low-tech level attacks. And we saw, obviously, the last one here in London by Osama Khan at the end of November last year, where it simply required this individual to have a knife to carry out an attack and try and utilize the camouflage of wearing what was perceived or could be perceived as a suicide vest to try and either prevent or delay members of the general public getting involved or the authorities for that matter. But I think what is also very clearly illustrated is that we have a number of tactical units that are constantly operating in London, and having that capability has allowed them to respond as quickly as they have.
Was a quick response, and it's interesting the speed at which police declare this a terror-related incident. When you compare it to past attacks, when authorities have sometimes taken hours, if not days, what does that tell you?
Well, certainly I think there are a couple of different factors here. I mean, there's the response to this particular incident, and there's also the response in communicating to the general public. And in the first instance, the biggest challenge that the authorities will always have is to try and deal with what we call the marauding terrorist attack. And this is the individual that is not static, that is moving across a particular area. And I know Streatham High Street very well. It's almost 2 miles in length. And it's a long stretch of road which is very, very busy at pretty much most times, and especially so on a Sunday afternoon. So it's identifying this precise location of the threat and then obviously dealing with it. But on the second level, the Metropolitan Police responding very quickly, not only confirming that it is a terrorist-related attack, but also that the perpetrator had been killed. And that, I think, is very reassuring for the general public.
Absolutely, no doubt. You mentioned that last terror attack in November. It was a 28-year-old man who was radicalised. He'd spent 8 years in prison and was shot dead on London Bridge. At the time, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, said the country wouldn't be divided, wouldn't be intimidated. What has changed since that attack?
Well, I don't think a great deal has changed. And I think since Prime Minister Johnson has come into power, he is inevitably trying to change the judicial system to try and protect us against individuals being released early on licence for terrorism-related offences. And he has pushing forward to the judicial system this minimum sentencing of 14 years served. But the challenge that we still have is in the de-radicalisation process. And as we saw with that particular instance at the end of November, Osama Khan was actually at a rehabilitation conference. He was allowed in that special circumstance to get into the centre of London. Now, what's quite unique about this incident today in London is the fact that this was carried out in Streatham High Street. Now, that's worrying on some levels because we know with terrorists, they've always wanted to choose iconic locations. And we've seen that historically, not only with the London Bridge attack last November, but also the previous London Bridge and Borough Markets as well, because it appeals to the international media.
All right, well, Geddes, good to get your perspective. Thank you so much for joining us from London. We are going to continue our breaking news coverage of this terror incident in London. A man shot dead after stabbing 2 people. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Breaking news out of London, where the police there say they've shot and killed an attacker in a terror-related incident. Now, this happened in Streatham, south of London, Sunday afternoon. A tweet from the Metro Police says there are at least 2 people injured and the scene is now contained. No word yet on the condition of those who are injured. Now, as I mentioned, they're calling this terror-related. One witness who has spoken to CNN said he heard shots fired and saw 3 bodies on the ground. Well, London Mayor Sadiq Khan responded to the incident, saying terrorists seek to divide and destroy our way of life here in London, and we will never let them succeed. Well, our international diplomatic editor, Nic Robertson, joins us from our London bureau. And Nic, I was just speaking to a security expert, Will Geddes, a short time ago about the radicalisation and de-radicalisation of people with inclinations to carry out a terrorist attack. And he mentioned the November attack back in London. What's the thinking from authorities there on how effective de-radicalisation is?
Yeah, it's a pressing issue, and one of the things that Boris Johnson, as we'll get us pointed out, Boris Johnson's trying to take a tougher line on this, and it does seem that this government wants to take a tougher line. The Prime Minister talked about keeping radical Islamist suspects or convicted radical Islamists in jail for longer. But there is a pressing, broader question, not just in Britain, but across Europe, about all the sort of radicalization that's been happening because of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, not just those returning, but the influence that has had on youngsters who have sometimes ended up in jail, becoming radicalized there. But it raises the question of when they're back out in the community, have they effectively been de-radicalized, for want of a better term? And the London Bridge attack in November really called that into question and put it into sharp focus. There was a UN report last week that draws information from multiple different countries around the world, and there was a report on dealing with Islamists and other types of terrorism. But one of the cases that it pointed out is just how pressing this is for European governments at the moment. Some European governments have been giving relatively short prison terms to those coming back from Iraq and Syria. One European country that the UN report didn't name said that there would be 1,000 former radical Islamist prisoners released this year. So this is a scale and an issue that, you know, at the moment is a pressing issue for the Home Secretary, Priti Patel. There are competing interests about who best and how to do the de-radicalization. But the assessment at the moment is there is not a system in place that works well. Just the week before last, I was talking to a former de-radicalized prisoner from a British jail. He was a senior Islamist radical prisoner in British jail on a terrorism offense. And he told me that, number one, radicalization within jails is an issue, and number two, that the system that the British government currently has in place to perform de-radicalization isn't working. We don't know enough about the incident today and who was involved and what happened behind it, but it will certainly raise this issue again, certainly in the public mind, at least, about how effective our governments in Europe, in Britain, etc., are able to deal with this threat. Because this is, as you were saying before, another attack just barely a month and a half after the last attack, and that does unnerve the populations, particularly here in London, where these attacks are taking place.
It must also frustrate police who are dealing with these sort of attacks, given, as you mentioned, there could be 1,000 people released that have tendencies to carry out attacks like this. As you mentioned, we don't know in this case much about the suspect at this point in time, what his motivations are. But it's interesting to note that police were pretty quick to say they believe he was indeed acting alone. What would authorities be doing right now to dig into his past?
They would go through any mobile phone devices that he had with him, perhaps go to where they believe he was living. I mean, one of the things that struck me, and again, this is a very early analysis, but just from watching the social media videos of this incident, that it was the plainclothes police officers with short handguns who were on the scene first. The way that they were dressed, the fact that they had handguns, tells me that these were quite possibly undercover counterterrorism officers. I can't say that with certainty, but as soon as the uniformed armed officers arrived in their uniform, in their highly visible police vehicles, and they got out with their rifles, the unarmed police, the undercover officers immediately went to them, and they worked together as a unit. And that seems to tell me that possibly, very possibly, the individual in question was already perhaps under surveillance and being followed. And this, if that's the case, and this is a very big if, but if that's the case, this would certainly allow the police to come forward with a very quick determination that this is terrorism related, because normally one would expect them to take a little bit of time to go through the personal effects, the phone, etc., of the person in question. Again, the canister strapped to the body would certainly give that impression. And when somebody has been shot dead in this way, the police are going to want to give a very solid reason very quickly for doing that, because otherwise that is a concern for the general public. But there is a possibility here that this person may have been under fairly close surveillance. And going back to what you said about the number of prisoners being released, this is a huge challenge for the police forces and the intelligence service to monitor in close quarters, 24/7, a potential terror suspect takes about 20 operatives. They all have to be well trained and very skilled in the art of following suspects. So it is hugely resource heavy to try to contain at an individual level this sort of threat.
It certainly is a fascinating analysis from you, Nic Robertson, especially considering the vision that we are seeing, as you mentioned, of plainclothes police officers responding to this attack so quickly. Good to have you with us from London. If you can stand by, we are going to take a quick break. We're going to have much more on this terror incident in South London in just a moment.